Hello, welcome to our panel discussion on COVID and the economy. My name is Sarah Smith. I'm head of the economics department, and I'm delighted to be joined by an expert panel today, and they'll be introducing themselves in a minute. Before we start, I'd just like to run through a few housekeeping items. So what we plan to do is to go through some of the questions that have been submitted in advance first, and then there'll be a chance for Q&A at the end. So please do use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to post any questions that you want answered by the panel. The session is being recorded, and after the session, you'll receive an email link to the recording in coming days. If you have any technical issues during the presentation, it's the usual advice of sort of logging off and logging on again. If you exit the Zoom meeting and re-enter, that usually fixes the problem. But if you continue to experience any problems, then please email alumni-events@bristol.ac.uk, and a member of the team will do their best to help you. So without further ado, I'd like my fellow panel members to introduce themselves.
Good afternoon. My name is Alex Wilmot-Sitwell. I graduated from the University of Bristol in 1983. I am currently a partner at the advisory firm Perella Weinberg, and I'm also Pro-Chancellor of the University and Chair of the Development Board.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eleonora Pantano. I'm from the School of Management, a senior lecturer in marketing, and I'm also the program director for BSc Marketing.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tobias Dieler. I'm a lecturer in finance with the Accounting and Finance Department of the University of Bristol.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Helen Simpson. I'm a professor of economics with interests in urban and regional economics, and I'm also a graduate of the University of Bristol. I graduated in 1995 from the BSc in economics.
Great, so that's brilliant. So I'm going to start, as I said, with one of the questions that was posted to us ahead of today's session. And I'm going to start by asking about the prospects for the economy as a whole. So Andy Haldane, the Bank of England's chief economist, optimistically perhaps forecast a V-shaped recovery. So I'd like to ask Alex, do you think he was just talking the economy up, or do you think we are likely to see a V-shaped recovery?
Well, I should preface my comments by saying that I'm not an economist, unlike Helen, so I will use that as my defense for any comments that I make that Helen violently disagrees with. But I would say that in a way I agree with him, but in a way I don't, which is an odd way of answering it, and I'm not trying to hedge my bets, but I do think it's extremely difficult to predict the recovery process following this COVID-19 situation. There will be a recovery, and we're already seeing it. I mean, the latest numbers out of China, for example, indicated a 3.2% recovery in economic output over the course of the last quarter. And we're seeing jobs data in the US, which indicates that there is a fairly quick recovery. The reason I don't agree with Andy Haldane is that I think V-shaped implies that the recovery will be, first of all, be very, very fast, and secondly, it will get back to where it was at the start of the COVID-19 situation very relatively quickly. And I think that is where I diverge or disagree, because I think whilst there will be quite a reasonable recovery in the short term, then it's going to be quite a long period over which the recovery will take place. And the reason I say that, and I think that, is because of the huge amount of uncertainty that exists. There is uncertainty about when a vaccine will be available, when social distancing rules will change, which is a huge brake on economic recovery. Will there be a second wave and further lockdowns, as we are seeing in some parts of the world already? And uncertainty is not the friend of economic recovery, because uncertainty means that businesses put off making investment decisions, strategic decisions, put off hiring and recruitment. And I think that we're already seeing the impact of when the government furlough scheme in this country comes off, for example. I suspect we're going to see a very significant uptick in unemployment. And my view is that we're probably not going to see the top of the V in terms of recovery for some time, certainly in my view for a couple of years. So there will be a recovery, but then I think it's going to be a very slow period of growth to get back to where we started pre-COVID-19 after that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think by V-shape, but you're exactly right. I think it means a sort of a rapid recovery to pretty much where we were. So Helen, as the economist on the panel, do you have anything you wish to kind of add?
Well, you'd be hard pressed to know that Alex wasn't an economist, because I'll just pretty much agree with him. I'm not the type of economist who does forecasts, but from just observing the type of behaviour since we've come out of lockdown, it seems to me evident that there will be some rebound in consumer demand, but it is not going to whiz straight back up to where we were before. And there's other strong indications that we're unlikely to return quickly to the position we were at before the pandemic, just in terms of the number of very large companies that have already announced that they're going to be letting people go. So both in high street shops, major high street retailers, but also in big manufacturing industries, for example, airline industries. And so these jobs are not going to be swiftly recovered. Add on top of that the prospect of Brexit, and I would agree that the extent of uncertainty means that firms are not going to be wanting to make major investments in physical capital, which would then lead to more jobs being created very quickly.
Yeah, thank you. We might come on to the B words later on. So, so economists are renowned for disagreeing, but actually we just started a poll of economists in the School of Economics at Bristol, suggested by one of our first year economics and politics students, actually. So he saw that there was, there's a famous IGM poll out of Chicago that regularly surveys US and European economists to ask their views, and he wanted to repeat the exercise for the Bristol Economics Department. So one of the first questions was exactly whether there'd be a rapid recovery, and the overwhelming majority of the Economics Department, the staff who responded to the survey, disagreed with Andy Haldane. So for the reasons that you said, I think the uncertainty, possibly Brexit, and the possibility of a second wave all mean that the recovery is likely to be pretty much, is likely to be slower than the V-shape kind of indicates. So a number of things have been changing quite a lot. We're all getting used to new ways of doing business, and many sectors of the economy have been hit very hard. I think it's likely to be a period when there are big changes in different sectors of the economy. So a number of the questions we got asked about, how COVID-19 might impact on the economy and lead to innovations and changes. So Eleonora, I'd like to start with you and ask about retailing. So some people have suggested that we're just never going to go back to the consumer habits that we had before. Do you think that's the case? Do you think kind of like retailing is going to profoundly change forever?
Retailing has changed much, because consumers have been forced to move to buy online, especially in the first months of the outbreak. So also people who didn't usually buy online was forced to do it, also for grocery purchases. And they familiarized with these new systems. But also they changed what they buy, because the need of certain products changed. So we saw a hit in food and essential stuff, but we saw a fall in other products like luxury. So consumers also moved to new brands. For instance, they started buying from retailers closer to their place, or to the brands which delivered the best experience online. And they can keep this behavior also when the pandemic is over, because now it passed enough time to change their habits. And they are also affected by the fear of contagion when they go to shop. So there is the fear of contagion, but there is also the uncertainty related to the job. So these reduce their ability to spend, their willingness to spend in not essential products. So we expect that this situation persists until the end of the pandemic. However, the second wave can hit again the sector, and we can see again a huge fall in purchases. We saw that many retailers didn't open their branch, while others saw many huge queues in front of the stores. So this pandemic also accelerated the changes in their models and the push towards new retail models and towards the digitalization. We saw that also some retailers decided to close some physical stores to invest more in the online platform to be prepared for the futures, because now we say that these crises affected a lot the sector. However, the scientists also say that in the future there could be other form of crises affecting retailing and also other sectors like tourism and so on.
So do you see kind of the death of the high street? Do you think just a further shift to online?
No, but the high street will need to change, because before the pandemic, the high street was also a place for social activities, and also retailing was a way to meet other person. But the social distancing rules interrupted this. And now we are trying to find a new balance between the sense of social inclusion related to the high street and the keep of social distancing under the threat of a new risk. So this is the time to redesign the shopping centers, the high streets, and also the supply chains.
So would you have any sort of specific suggestions of how to do that? How to kind of breathe new life into our high streets and our shopping centers?
The first suggestion is to communicate to consumers that the stores are safe by keeping, of course, the rules and the guidelines of the government. For instance, they introduced a new rule related to wearing masks within the stores from the next week. This would protect consumers, but also give them the sense of safety. So the idea is to invest in making the stores safe, and also to invite people to go out under the guidelines and the rules to meet again the world, because people was so forced to stay at home that now they can feel afraid to leave a home for the risk of contagion, to go in a crowd streets, crowd shopping centers and store.
So the Chancellor is trying to incentivize us to go out and, well, at least not necessarily go shopping, but go to restaurants through the sort of the £10 meal deal that's available in August. Do you think that will help overcome people's fear of going out and about?
Yes, this kind of incentives could motivate people to give a try. Yes?
No, I was sorry. And I was saying, the reality is it's going to need a lot more than a meal voucher from the Chancellor of the Exchequer to kickstart the economy. And I don't know if anybody saw Andrew Bailey's comments to the Select Committee in Parliament yesterday, really putting some pressure from a central bank point of view on getting the government to start changing its recommendations and its advice, because business districts are empty. Restaurants are empty, theatres are closed, obviously. The fact is that until public transport is operating at somewhere between 15 and 20% of capacity. Until people actually get over the fear factor and until government's advice changes to start encouraging people to leave their homes and go back to work and to start behaving a little bit more like normal, then the economy is not going to recover in anything other than a highly sort of small, very small and insignificant way. And a meal voucher is not going to do it. The government needs to start changing advice, and the government needs to start working out that until the economy starts to move forward properly and sustainably, we're not going to see any recovery. And the danger of the longer they take to do that, the danger is that the longer it's going to be before that recovery kicks in. And in fact, it could get a lot worse.
I think you mentioned uncertainty before. I think one of the issues has been the lack of clarity around the advice. It's not just providing the advice, but making sure it's very clear. I think that's been a real...
Well, it doesn't help they change their mind every 5 minutes.
and seem to disagree between them.
I mean, the same arguments would apply with the VAT cut. First of all, whether this prices will actually reduce, and then how demand will respond. You can't expect a big response to this type of policy if people aren't going to work and then going out to buy their lunch, for example. It's simply not going to be enough. The previous VAT cut was much more across the board, and there you saw people, changing the timing which they brought major durable goods like a washing machine. But in this case, we're talking about sort of going out for lunch, so you could expect a much smaller effect on spending.
Yeah, because the point is that people learned to eat at home. So now they are used to eat at home. So what do you really give them to teach them again that they can feel rewarded in eating in a restaurant under the risk of the contagion? Similarly, people stopped buying luxury goods because they realized that they didn't need during the pandemic. So how you convince them that they need again, and they start buying again?
I think a lot of the eating at home is linked very much to working at home, which has been one of the big changes that we've seen. I think, Alex, you had some thoughts on about the sort of the move to working from home, and whether you thought this was likely to be, again, a long-lasting change that we saw coming out of the pandemic. Do you think that we're working in it?
Yes, I think there will be a significant and permanent change to the way in which we work in the future. I don't think that's undesirable at all, because I think that we waste a huge amount of time traveling to and from work, and money. And frankly, technology does allow for a much more flexible approach to a lot of the jobs, not all, but a lot. So I think that that's actually one of the positive outcomes that will come out of this. You still need offices, you still need teamwork, you still need collaboration, you still need training, you still need to be working alongside colleagues in an office environment, but you don't need to do that 5 days a week. You don't need to spend, the average commute for most people in this country is nearly 2 hours a day. That's an enormous amount of time that is basically lost from the point of view of productive contribution, and it's very expensive because of the train fares, travel fares, etc. So I think that could be a very beneficial component, but it will take a bit of time to work out. Clearly, we need to get through social distancing. We have to get a vaccine for that to happen. That's probably still some time off, though we're going to live in this rather strange environment for a while. But yes, I think going forward, working from home, more flexible working environment is definitely going to be something that is going to be a permanent fixture and feature. And I think that could be a great positive, actually.
But again, I guess as with the sort of likely changes to the high street, it will leave us with a lot of commercial real estate, which will need repurposing, possibly. I don't know.
It just needs to be, it needs to be repurposed. And but I think that there are certain areas and districts that are going to suffer, value destruction as a result. I wouldn't want to be any large-scale commercial office landlord at the moment. But that will. New uses for that space will be found, and maybe the economic costs of that will change to the benefit of tenants.
Helen, did you want to add anything as someone who's sort of economic geography expert?
I mean, I agree with what Alex says. I think there will be things that are lost as a result of people not being in the office very regularly and meeting other individuals face to face. It's very clear that companies can save quite a lot of money also by having people working from home as opposed to coming into the office. But there's going to be, you know, a great deal of creativity, I think, that could potentially be lost through this. And some people don't want to work from home. If you're told they might want to work from a shared working space in town, they're not necessarily going to want to be at home all day. It makes the job quite different, I think. And so there is an element of human interaction that we think face-to-face that is very valuable, certainly in some creative industries. That said, I do agree that there will be more home working. And to be honest, if there was a fall in the price of office space in central London, you know, is that really a bad thing? Well, for some people who own that land, that property, yes, but maybe in general, no. It might enable more people, different people to live there, different businesses to locate there. And I also think, you know, in terms of thinking about the regional inequalities in the UK, quite a lot of it is driven by where very highly skilled people choose to live and work. If more people work from home or from shared office spaces, we could start to see a different distribution of where the highly skilled choose to live, work, and also to sort of consume locally. So I think there could be some interesting implications of this regionally as well.
So one unintended consequences could be the government achieving its levelling up agenda and sort of reducing the premium on London, I guess. So
yes, I mean, particularly if it also goes for some sort of property-based wealth tax further down the line, we might see that a lot of people who've gained quite a lot simply by owning property and land in London over the last 20 years, perhaps the rebalancing might take effect through that route as well.
May I add something to this? Oh.
Absolutely.
So it's also in connection to one of the questions in the Q&A from Denzel. So I think that there could be like a rebalancing also of property prices between rural and urban areas, right? So I mean, as people don't have to live close to their workplace anymore, they can go and live in more rural areas. And I think there has been a bit of signs that people have started searching for more rural properties, and so this might also relieve a little bit the like, I don't want to call it housing bubble, but I mean these extremely high
price disparities,
extremely high prices in city centers, and yeah, in favor of prices in more rural areas.
Yeah, that's a really helpful point. I mean, it's interesting that this reflecting on the value people place on face-to-face interactions. This is obviously something we're really dealing with as a university. So one of the Q&As we had before the event related to, you know, what is the University of Bristol doing? Is it rethinking its business model? And clearly, in a world in which we need to enforce social distancing, we are having to rethink, in a sense, our education production function and how we deliver education. You know, we're anticipating that students actually place quite a high premium on face-to-face. So, you know, we're thinking about a blended model in which there'll be some online, but some face-to-face interaction. What will be interesting will be to see whether it's a movement along a continuum. You know, we already deliver quite a lot of our education online because we put material online, we record our lectures, students often consume the lectures online because they will go over them again, and they'll also look at the online lectures if they can't attend in person. So, you know, we'll be moving sort of more of what we do online and slightly reducing the face-to-face just because of the social distancing. But again, it's sort of like, I guess it's sort of innovation almost by stealth. So it's not a complete transformation, but it's certainly a big movement in how we do things. And it will be interesting to see what the direction of travel is. But I think it will take a while for students to get used to the new model and for us to be able to deliver it in an effective way that everyone's sort of comfortable with. But I guess what is really interesting is how the pandemic is forcing these changes and forcing us to think about what we do and hopefully make the most of the opportunities to improve what we do. So Tobias, if I could come back to you. So your area of expertise is particularly in finance. Is that a sector where you see big changes happening?
So I would like to start to answer this question by trying to make a comparison between the great financial crisis 2008 and this economic crisis. So I think the great financial crisis following on from the Lehman default in 2008 was purely made by the financial industry. So I mean, lenders handing out mortgages to probably borrowers which should not have been eligible for mortgages, and then I mean, in turn, these mortgages were repackaged and sold across the entire financial market, so that everybody had a little share of this. And I think this crisis we are experiencing now is very different in this respect. I mean, it is a supply and a demand shock at the same time, essentially. And so one could think, I mean, a priori, the financial industry should not be affected, but I would like to argue that the financial industry can still be a propagator of this economic crisis we are seeing right now, and I mean, in many ways. So I mean, in modern economies, especially the banking sector is very interconnected through the interbank market. Essentially, banks finance themselves short-term by borrowing and lending from each other. This is a multi-trillion-dollar market. So if one of these banks then gets into solvency problems for example, because they are allowing for mortgage holidays, they are handing out credit lines, they are non-performing loans. So essentially, they have a shortage on their revenue side, and then get into trouble into paying their own liabilities in the interbank market. That can quickly lead on to a domino effect in the banking sector and in the financial markets at large. So this has so far apparently been preempted, and probably this is probably something we learned from the great financial crisis, is that central banks quickly stepped in, provided the financial market with huge amounts of liquidity, bought corporate bonds from banks. So that helped the banks, at least in the last months, to stay afloat, to keep solvent. And but I think what is going to be interesting is what is going to happen, and I think both Alex and Helen alluded to this before, when essentially the subsidies from governments start to cease, and the current recovery we are seeing in stock markets is probably partly fueled by these government subsidies. And the question is, what happens if these subsidies stop? And well, how many bankruptcies of corporations will we see? How many people will be laid off? And that will hugely affect then also the livelihood of banks, obviously, as I mean, in terms of how many of their loans will not be repaid, etc., etc. So I think it is too early to draw the conclusion that the financial sector, I mean, it seems now the financial sector went through okay. I think it's too early to draw this conclusion, as we still are in a phase in which the economy is to large parts fueled by these government interventions.
Yeah, I mean, government is playing a major role. I think you know, if you take into account the salaries of people on furlough and the size of the public sector, then you know, then basically, you know, the majority of the economy is sort of being paid directly or indirectly via the government.
There's on that quickly. There's one of the questions that came in from Thomas was around whether the stock markets reflect the true nature of the economic environment or position that we find ourselves in. And just to echo something that Tobias said, I mean, the fact is central banks have pumped over $9 trillion into the system in the last 4 months. $9 trillion. Central bank balance sheets have ballooned by an average of about 15% in that period. And the fact is $9 trillion and zero interest rates means that that money goes somewhere. It's not going to go onto deposit. It's going to go largely into financial markets. And therefore, there is a very strong correlation between that massive expansion of government balance sheets and the stock market recovery over the last few months.
I guess the question then is what happens in the medium to long term? That all depends on the strength of the underlying economy.
Depends on the strength of the underlying economy, because essentially markets are simply an assessment of businesses' performance, capability. And what we're seeing actually is fairly reasonably good results coming out in the second quarter from the very recent sort of results announcements from corporates at the higher end of expectations. So that would actually in some respects reinforce current market performance. But it's going to depend on how do governments, and another question was how are governments going to pay for all of this, which is how, what is the impact on inflation, and these are all going to be big factors in that. And we could that's a sort of question for enormous sort of speculation and debate.
Yes, we can certainly come on to some of those things. I think later the issue of the debt and how this is going to be repaid is a really important one.
Can I add something to this?
Sorry, Tobias.
Yeah, just adding to what Alex said. Essentially, I mean, since there is this huge central bank intervention creating these super cheap loans, this also has a strong effect on the. I want to highlight the insurance industry or the pension funds, because most of their revenues are coming from fixed income revenues, and obviously those are all suffering a lot with these large central bank interventions. So it is this will put even more pressure on our pension funds in the medium to long term. I mean, they have already suffered since the great financial crisis from these super cheap central bank money, but they will suffer even more now. And I think we have to start thinking really hard about how we finance our pension funds in the medium to long run.
Okay, thank you. So we've just had a mini budget from the Chancellor setting out some possible measures to get the economy going, one of which I think the panel's view of is a bit dim in terms of the meal deal. But what about some of the other measures? I mean, we've got large spending on infrastructure, and we have the sort of 1,000 bonus for employers who re-employ furloughed workers. Do you think any of those are going to help? So perhaps Helen, I mean, thinking about this sort of the levelling up and the impact of coronavirus on different parts of the region, do you see prospects for regions benefiting from perhaps some of the infrastructure spending, or how might that be targeted to help deal with some of the regional disparities that we face?
I mean, I think it's quite clear that the pandemic has shone a light on some underlying inequalities, in particular across individuals and across regions that have been there for a very long time. So it's shone light on health inequalities, inequalities in educational outcomes, inequalities in job security, in quality of housing, and a whole set of dimensions of economic and social outcomes that we care about. And I think at the minute, the sort of the mini budget isn't the whole thing. The Chancellor doesn't know what's the situation is going to be like in 3 months' time. And so the next time he's making announcements, perhaps there will be some bigger announcements that can really do more here. In terms of thinking about public spending, many of the areas I've mentioned are core areas of public spending. If the government decided that it wanted to spend more on healthcare and education, because these are public services that people consume where they live, if the government wants to increase that spending, then potentially it could be better targeted towards those individuals and those areas that need it even more. And we might start seeing some changes in how spending is distributed across the regions. Typically, it's been easier to justify a case for spending money on infrastructure in London because the value of the benefits, if you use things like wages to value the benefits, tends to be higher. And so the government could start to think again about how it actually values public spending in different locations. And if it does choose to start spending more outside of London, it will have to acknowledge that there are trade-offs here in terms of how that spending potentially benefits aggregate growth for the whole country versus outcomes in those areas that have been lagging behind for a number of years now. I think another thing that the pandemic has really shone light on is something, again, something else that we've known has been a trend for a while, and that's changes in technology, moves towards automation. We've seen that working from home has required technology infrastructure. So again, in terms of thinking about government spending, we might want to think about, ensuring excellent broadband access to all parts of the country. That could potentially benefit coastal communities, which we know have been hit hard by this pandemic. And going back to what Tobias said earlier, perhaps people will want to change where they live if they can really work from practically anywhere. So I think a big dimension of what the government will have to do if it wants to start to level up is really grasp the nettle of where this spending takes place, where it wants to generate jobs within the economy. And it could work on the presumption that London itself is quite likely to be able to bounce back from this much easier than regions which have been, relatively lagging behind for years.
So I think if we sort of start turning to some of the questions that have come in under the Q&A. So I think a couple are sort of picking up on, is this a turning point in the economy, and should we start thinking more broadly about, growth and progress and moving away from a very narrow focus on spending and consumption and GDP, and think a bit more broadly about, what progress might look like, and whether we can sort of perhaps think about a green economy and a green recovery. So perhaps Eleonora, could I start by asking you to comment on that question? Sort of those sort of ideas. Should we sort of stop the focus of spending-driven GDP growth and start thinking more broadly about a sort of a green recovery and alternative forms of progress?
Yeah, because the point is not to reduce the consumption, is to move the consumption towards a more sustainable perspective. So what now the pandemic totally changed the consumption, mass consumption, etc. But now we can take this as an opportunity to move towards a green perspective, something more sustainable. For instance, now there is the issue related to the mask that cannot recycled easily, and we stopped using reusable caps because of the risk of contagion. But now we have to think more to sustainability, sustainable consumption, recycling products, and so on. So investing in these will be rewarding in the medium and the long term.
Thank you. So do you have any practical pointers for a sort of a green recovery or shift in consumption to be more sustainable?
Company, with the help of the government, can move more towards a sustainable supply chain, greener products, because now the production and manufacturing totally changed because of the reduction in consumption. But we cannot forget that there is still the climate emergency. So companies still need to invest on this. And now the government new incentives, as other countries did, are pushing towards a new way of consumption, new way for manufacturing and producing goods. So the thing is, don't forget this focus, which was one of the main focus before the pandemic.
So going back to this issue, should we just stop focusing on GDP? So Alex, if everyone is working from home and not commuting 2 hours a day, they're happier, but they're not spending on transport, they're not buying their lunch out. So in a sense, it would be bad for the economy, but it's good for people's well-being. So do you think we are too focused on GDP and we need to try and capture some of these broader changes that might come about?
The answer is probably yes, but at the end of the day, consumption is a pretty important measure of how an economy is performing, because without the process of consumption, then the whole supply chain sort of becomes weakened, and at the end of the day, that is a measure that will continue, I think, to be a key way in which we assess economic performance. But yes, I think that we are going to change our work practices, leisure practices, and consumption will change. To pick up on Eleonora's point, I mean, I think that the green agenda can be massively boosted by tax breaks, by investment incentives, and we're seeing that, and that will continue to feed on itself and accelerate. I think big infrastructure projects, particularly ones focused on sustainability, will be important. One of the biggest features of the post-Second World War period of economic growth was the massive investment in infrastructure. Now, it was relatively easier then because the whole of Europe had to be rebuilt. So obviously there was quite a lot of obvious projects to be targeted, and that's less so now. But there are things that we can do and should do, and I think probably and hopefully will do. But yes, we do need to look at different measures. Also, I think going back to the point, so when I say that we're going to have a different type of working environment in the future, I'm not suggesting for a moment that everybody's going to work from home all the time. But I think that more flexibility in the workplace is going to be a permanent feature of the way in which we work going forward. And but I think that there's that different measures are. It is very one-dimensional, the way in which we look at the economy at the moment. I agree.
And this idea of infrastructure, I mean, Helen's mentioned an important part of infrastructure for the new economy that might emerge is obviously access to wireless, broadband, and another infrastructure I think which we've sort of realised has been underappreciated is sort of access to good childcare. I mean, I think so. There's a question below about the sort of the implications of COVID-19 for gender equality. I think most of the research, including some that I contribute to at Bristol, have shown that there has been a massive increase in home childcare during this current pandemic, and that most of this home childcare has been done by women. So there are sort of profound changes going on within the home which might well play out in terms of future gender pay gap and women's sort of career progression, given the fact that for the last 3 or 4 months many women have been juggling both sort of working and childcare. I mean, I don't know how you feel about this. Is anyone else sort of slightly concerned that the sort of gender progress might be set back by the current pandemic?
I mean, I think we know from other studies that mothers have some preference for having shorter commutes to work so that they can better manage childcare and working. But obviously, by accepting that trade-off, they are potentially hits to their career, hits to wages from working part-time and working from home. I think we should be a bit careful about exactly what the costs and benefits of a shift towards home working are overall. And I think this pandemic has made clear that women are quite often working in sectors that have been hit economically and might be in less secure jobs. They've also been in jobs which involve more face-to-face contact, and so have been, if you look at the profile of deaths over this pandemic, you can see that women of about my age have been hit proportionally more than men, probably because of the types of occupations they're in healthcare. So I'm less convinced that working from home is necessarily a great thing. But
I wasn't actually suggesting. I mean, I think many women might value the home working. It's more, they certainly don't value the home working when there's no childcare. And I think, so the closure of schools, the closure of nurseries, and actually, so the government is now allowing holiday clubs and wraparound care to reopen, but I think a lot of the care providers are saying it's very difficult. It's very difficult because of the uncertainty. It's very difficult because we've been closed. It's very difficult to operate profitably in this new, or even to break even basis in this new environment. So I think so from that point of view, I just wondered whether there was sort of you shared concerns about how this pandemic might play out in terms of its differential impacts on men and women. As you said, women have been more likely to lose their jobs because of where the sectors they work in. And without the sort of childcare infrastructure there, I think that might well mean that there are sort of longer term implications for the sort of career progression and progression in closing the gender pay gap. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything. So yeah, I think, you know, that's certainly what this pandemic has done is really expose multiple inequalities, regional, gender, ethnic. So it's going to make us look again at lots of features of our modern society. So I wanted to pick up on this issue of, you know, how are we going to pay for all of this? So, you know, the government, I think quite rightly, is stepping in because of its, you know, unique position in society as being able to, you know, help and try and stabilize the economy. Does anyone have concerns about the sort of mounting long-term debt, or any sort of thoughts about the best way or the most likely way that the government is going to seek to try and reduce the debt in the medium or longer term? Tobias, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit of a heterogeneous problem. It depends a bit on the country and where they were standing before. So I think we have the typical, in Europe, we have a bit of the typical north-south divide. And so, I mean, countries like Italy, Spain, Greece, I think or Portugal, they will probably continue to suffer even more from this surmounting debt. At the same time, I mean, we always have this idea that there's an optimal amount of debt, but I mean, and then the European Union defines these thresholds which should not be surpassed. I mean, and there's kind of controversial research on this, and it doesn't seem to be conclusive on how high exactly should be a country's debt. So I mean, I'm not saying that we should continue. We should continue in just increasing debt, but if it's increasing debt for very profitable projects or very profitable investments, I think it is the right thing to take these debts. Then it ultimately depends on how efficiently this money is invested, and I think this is more of the problem which divides or separates countries.
And what about, so how do you, at some point this is going to have to be repaid? Do you think, what do you see as being likely, a return to austerity or sort of possible future tax increases?
I mean, it seems likely that tax increases might come before a return to austerity. It would seem very odd to me to be spending an awful lot of money and then suddenly turn the tap off on that. And we can think of ways that these tax rises might occur, which are in line with the objectives we want to achieve. So thinking about how we tax non-environmentally friendly behaviors or production. So thinking again about things like a carbon tax, and also, going back to the things that the pandemic has shone a light on, how we can reduce inequality, and thinking about how we tax wealth, again, is something I think the governments will very obviously return to. Now, these aren't things that raise an awful lot of tax revenue. So it may be that at some point, things that raise more money, income tax, do have to go up. And there are, examples within Europe of economies which have much higher public spending and much higher tax rates, and also some very good outcomes on other indicators. So we might want to think about moving in that direction.
I mean, just to add at one point, I mean, I think that we, and to Tobias's point on terms of what the right level of debt is, and I'm not going to try and answer that, but what I would say is that the current levels of relatively high indebtedness that we're seeing across the world with governments are going to be with us for a long time. You can't turn this around quickly. And therefore, it is going to be a sort of long period of relatively higher indebtedness that we're going to be faced with. I think you've got to be careful around tax, because of course taxes can be a double-edged sword, because it can actually prevent growth and prevent the stimulation of the economy, which is actually much more beneficial to the long-term health of the country than the short-term fiscal impact of higher taxation. So I agree with Helen, there is going to be a change in tax, and there will be higher taxes per se. one's got to be quite careful that one doesn't sort of end up killing the economy as a consequence of that. So it's a balancing act, and it's going to be a challenge. I do not believe that austerity is either the right answer nor the likely answer.
So in terms of kind of non-economic activity killing tax increases, so what would your advice to Rishi Sunak be in terms of?
Well, I think that you should certainly be looking at taxes on environmentally unfriendly businesses, because that would only just reinforce the importance of people to changing their approach to the way they do business. I certainly think that you need to probably look at some wealth taxes and maybe income tax, because actually income tax is much the most sort of productive source of income for the government. But it's got to be balanced in as much as not going so far as to either put people off being in this country or coming to this country or basing their businesses in this country, because as we all know, businesses are on the whole extremely mobile. And, you know, we don't want to push people to other jurisdictions and base their business there for them to benefit. So it's a balancing act. And I think that
related to that, and going back to what Eleonora was saying earlier, if people are really going to be having this huge shift to online purchasing, one thing that governments internationally are going to have to deal with is how exactly we tax this highly mobile activity of companies which are providing online services, goods purchased online. And we can see huge examples of that all the time in the newspapers of countries which are basically shifting activities in order to try and avoid tax. And that's something which could be done internationally to try and deal with that, particularly if consumption moves in that direction.
So interestingly and very relevant to Bristol, Massive Attack have released a new song in conjunction with Professor Gabriel Zucman about taxing multinationals. So I think they've gone into, so Massive Attack have gone into the political economic space. So I actually recommend that you watch their series of 3 videos, you know, particularly if you're feeling nostalgic about Bristol trip hop. I think you can some economic analysis with some quite good music as well. So let's recommend that to you. Okay, so moving back to the questions. So we've covered the debt and the green economy. I mean, I guess one thing that we haven't so much touched on is, you know, so I think sort of thinking about the implications for young people and, you know, the large numbers of people entering the labour market or, you know, and or losing their jobs, you know. Is there anything you'd like to see in terms of measures to help people entering the labour market or to help with people kind of getting jobs?
I mean, I think there was some evidence that the previous sort of Future Job Start programme did have some impact on helping young people out of long-term unemployment. I mean, I think we're going to have to think really creatively about schemes, training schemes, job creation schemes, or even thinking about going back to policies where we were subsidising job creation in areas of in locations within the country where unemployment was very high. So the government would essentially provide subsidies for firms to invest in physical capital in particular areas, and in return they had to guarantee to create a certain number of jobs. I mean, in order to deal with this type of problem, again, it is going to have to be very large scale training schemes or job creation programs, which also involve, in a way, the demand side. So getting companies to invest in those locations where jobs are very scarce. Because we haven't really seen these locations recover from what happened in the 1980s. And so unless something quite fundamental is done, we're just going to be back there again. But I think we also need to think about what skills young people are going to need over the next 20 years. If you're currently in a coastal economy, and unless you change your, you know, the type of training or apprenticeship that you receive, which would allow you much more flexibility in the type of jobs that you can take up over the next 20 years, I can't see this problem really changing if you're only ever training in an apprenticeship in those industries which are really local to you. It's a very difficult problem to grapple with.
I agree with Helen completely. I think that there needs to be a wholesale reassessment and retooling of the way in which we train young people. I mean, the fact is that we just need to take a leaf out of what Germany do with high-level technical apprenticeships, and that needs to be wholesale across the entire economy. I mean, we're faced with unprecedented levels of industry and business disruption as a result of technology, and there's absolutely no point in training young people for an economy of the past rather than the future. So I think that that's a critical area, but it's not straightforward. It doesn't happen immediately, and it needs to be very large scale, as Helen said.
So we're nearing the end of the time we have. So I just wanted to sort of finally raise mention the B word again. And so we have a question about how do the panelists see the impact of COVID-19 on international trade? I mean, we can't really address that question without referring to Brexit. So, you know, would you like to sort of give your views on, you know, on Brexit and the prospects for the UK and its international trade relations?
I mean, I actually think that in terms of the sectors that are most likely to be hit by, for example, a no-deal Brexit versus the sectors that are currently being hit by COVID-19, I think there are some differences. So the sectors that are currently being hit are retail, tourism. The sectors that are at risk from a no-deal Brexit are potentially more manufacturing or services, which are more professional services. And in particular, if you think of an organization or a firm that is both importing intermediate inputs from Europe and then re-exporting a final good to Europe or elsewhere, these companies are going to be having to grapple with huge potential changes to the way they do business if there are changes to tariffs, for example. So I actually think that quite different sectors are likely to be hit by the two events in terms of, you know, employment, for example.
And I think we also just have to worry about the capacity of the government to deal with these multiple challenges. I mean, I think the one thing we've seen is, you know, how you respond to challenges really depends on, you know, the government and its ability to deal with things. And it seems very risky to be going into a huge other major change, which is going to put even more overload on the sort of the capacity of the government and the capacity of the civil service. I don't know, does anyone else want to add anything about trade and Brexit? Or have a final word before we wrap up?
It's the only good thing about COVID-19 is that we haven't been talking about Brexiters.
We will do from, I think I've noticed it's creeping into the headlines and the newspapers increasingly, actually. I have a feeling.
I would just echo what you said. I just think that there's the government's ability to be able to handle everything that is taking place with regard to the economic disruption of the pandemic and deal with Brexit. I'm still hopeful that some form of extension can be achieved, because I think that the impact of a hard Brexit at the end of this year is A, very real, and B, very negative. And I don't know quite how they deal with everything that remains outstanding in the period allowed, but we'll see. Yes.
Okay, so I'd like to thank the panel members for their comments and lively discussion. So that is all we have time for today. So thank you very much for submitting your questions, both beforehand and during the event. We sort of tried to deal with them thematically, if not sort of by question. So I hope you feel you've got your topic has been covered. So we'll be logging off in a minute, but for anyone who would like to stay and say hello to fellow alumni, the meeting will be kept running for another 20 minutes, and you'll be able to use the chat function found at the bottom of your screen. So hopefully you might find some old friends and make some new friends. So thank you very much for your time and for attending. Thank you again to the panel. So keep in touch, stay safe and well, and enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of the summer. Thank you very much.